All right, macro students, this is a video tutorial to help you with the organizer that was assigned in yesterday's class. What this organizer is intended for is to help you understand the concepts of fiscal and monetary policy and how it can be applied to recessions and expansions. And what we're going to look at here are some of the characteristics of monetary policy and fiscal policy, and then how the government or Federal Reserve uses them, either when times are too tough in recessions or when the economy is running too hot in expansions. All right, so we're going to start with expansions. I'm going to be doing a little editing. Feel free to take any notes that you'd like. And here we go. All right, so oh, geez. Erase that. All right, with when the economy is in an expansion, that means your short run equilibrium is ahead of long run. I'll show you what that looks like in a second. And so that means that over time, inflation is going to occur according to economic theory. Prices are going to rise as people spend a lot of money, demand goods and services, leads to higher price levels, leads to workers bargaining for higher wages. And so to control the spread of inflation and to make sure that inflation doesn't get out of control, both Congress and the Fed are going to try and reel in the economy. They're going to try and downsize the economy so that prices stabilize over a sustained period of time. And so what Congress is going to do here is they're going to increase taxes, and what they're going to do is they're going to cut government spending. And so the idea behind this is by increasing taxes, it takes money out of people's pockets, and decreasing spending takes money out of the economy, which would lower aggregate demand. And so this policy type is known as contractionary policy. I'm not even going to bother writing it out. And so because of that, aggregate demand would fall. Okay? I think it says right here, aggregate demand. Yep, effect on aggregate demand. So what you'd show in a graph, sticking with fiscal policy right here. Well, starting off, your long run should be over here. This should be your long run. So ignore that. And with the decrease in government spending and the increase in taxes, that means aggregate demand is going to shift to the left. All right. With monetary policy, the Fed is also going to pursue contractionary policy. What the Fed is going to pursue here is contractionary policy. And so what they're going to do is they're going to, oh man, that should look like an S. That's an S. They're going to sell bonds. They're going to sell bonds, so money is going to go from the banks to the Fed, and the Fed is going to sell bonds to the banks. So you got to track where the money is going here. So by selling bonds to the banks and getting money in return, that's taking money out of the money supply. So if we go down here to our money supply graph, that means money supply is going to shift to the left, M1. And so now, look what happens. There's Q1. So since your money supply shifted to the left, there's less money in the economy. Interest rates are higher. They were once here, now they're up here. And the quantity of money has decreased. Okay, so the Fed has achieved its goal. It's taken money out of the economy in the hope of bringing prices down. Some other tools that they could pursue here, they could increase the federal funds rate and increase the discount rate. Both are intended to make it harder to lend money out, thereby bringing about a fall in prices or deflation. With the loanable funds market, something that you're going to be learning about in today's class. So because banks have less money to loan out, the supply of loanable funds is going to shift to the left. And also because of the increase in interest rates and the fall in demand for loanable funds is going to decrease as well. So the interest rate here stays about the same, and the quantity of loanable funds decreases. Okay. So to answer some questions here, it's asking based off of these policies, based off the contractionary policy that the Congress and the Fed is pursuing, real GDP is going to fall because people have less money to spend, taxes are higher, there's less available loans, interest rates are higher. Keep in mind that with bond prices, there's an inverse relationship between bond prices and interest rates. So if interest rates are increasing, as shown in this money market graph, interest rates are going up. That means the price of bonds is falling. Bank reserves, because now the reserve requirement is higher, and because banks are loaning less money out, bank reserves are going to increase because there's a higher reserve requirement. Banks don't have as much money to loan out. Because the reserve requirement is higher now, the money multiplier decreases. Anytime the reserve requirement increases, the money multiplier decreases. One way to think of that, if the reserve requirement was 10% and was raised to 20%, think of your money multiplier formula. 1 over 0.10 is 10, and 1 over 0.20 would be 5. Okay, so it's validated right there. Interest rates would rise. Price levels would fall, as evidenced in this graph. Okay. And the unemployment rate would rise. Because with the fall in aggregate demand, that means businesses are starting to cut back. More people are out of work. Anytime real GDP is falling, the unemployment rate is rising. Businesses are producing less, so they need less workers. Okay? All right, so that's what our government policymakers do when there's an expansion, when we're in an expansionary gap. And keep in mind, this graph that I drew here was wrong. This is the point you want to start with, and your long run curve should be right here. So just ignore this. This is where you're starting, and this is where you're finishing. Okay? Any questions on that, just email me or put them up in the Google Meet that we'll do. All right, what the economy is going to do when times are tough. And what we're starting with here, we're starting at this point right here. This is known as a recessionary gap. Notice right here that Y1 is behind YF. You're behind full employment. That means more people are out of work. Businesses aren't producing as much because of the lack of demand for goods and services. And so what this part of the organizer does is it looks at what the Fed and Congress do to deal with the situation, to get people back to work, to get businesses spending again, to get people spending money in the economy again. Very similar to what's going on right now and what Congress and the Fed has done. And so what fiscal policy is going to enact is going to be a decrease in taxes, which is something that President Trump has talked about right now, trying to cut taxes not only for consumers but for businesses to try and get them going again during this COVID-19 crisis. And this has already happened. Last week they passed, I think it was a $2 trillion spending bill, the largest spending bill in modern history, in the history of the U.S. government. Added $2 trillion to our debt. But the idea behind it is to give people money so they can still spend it. They can pay their rent. They can pay their mortgage. They can pay bills and buy groceries, necessities to get them through this quarantine time. So right here, if you're having trouble with this, think about what the government just did last week. They spent a whole bunch of money to try and stimulate the economy in this unprecedented time. I'm just going to abbreviate this. This type of policy, expansionary policy. Just think, what does the government want to do when times are tough? They want to grow the economy, expand it, expansionary policy. The effect on aggregate demand, what they want here is they want to grow aggregate demand, and they want to increase aggregate demand from this point, and they want to get it either to full employment or ahead of full employment. All right? So now we dealt with fiscal policy. What's the Fed going to do in this situation? All right, so what the Fed is going to do, I'm just going to put a B here. They're going to buy bonds from banks. Okay? So they're going to give, that's a B for buy, and then there's the money sign. The Fed is going to give money to the banks. And in return, banks money is going to go from the Fed to the banks. All right, I think I lost my connection there, but I should be good now. Okay, so with monetary policy, what the Fed is going to do to try and pump money in the economy, they're going to buy bonds from the banks, B for buy. They're going to give money to the banks for these bonds. So banks in return are going to give bonds to the Fed, and they're going to get money. So the banks have a whole bunch of money to use. And what the Fed is also going to do, they're going to make it easier for banks to borrow from other banks. That's the federal funds rate. And they're also going to make it easier for banks to borrow from the Fed. One thing I didn't put in here, and I don't think I have it at the bottom too, reserve requirements. Reserve requirements. Reserve requirements are going to decrease. The whole idea behind this is for it to be easier for banks to take that money that they just received in the open market operations and loan it out. So what's going to happen now? The money supply is going to increase. There's M1. So your interest rate, your nominal interest rate was here. And now, with the increase in the money supply, the fall in the federal funds rate, your interest rate's going to fall. And so let's look at the effect it has on the loanable funds market. The supply of loanable funds, banks have a whole bunch of money, so the supply of loanable funds is going to increase. And because interest rates are lower, people want to borrow more money. So the demand for loans is going to increase as well. So the effect on interest rates is going to stay the same here, but there's definitely more quantity. There's a higher quantity of loanable funds. All right. And then lastly, what happens based off of these expansionary policies to real GDP? Well, if you look, you start here at Y1. With the increase in the money supply, with the cut in taxes, increase in government spending, real GDP is going to increase. Keep in mind with bond prices, it's an inverse relationship between interest rates and bond prices. So if interest rates are falling, that means bond prices are rising. If you have questions on that, just ask me in the Google Meet. Bank reserves would decrease because now banks are loaning more money out, so they have less in their reserves. But that's okay, because if they're out of money, they could always borrow it from the Fed. It's cheaper because of the decrease in the discount rate, or they could borrow from other banks. With the decrease in the reserve requirement, the money multiplier is going to increase. Interest rates Just look at this money market graph right here. Interest rates will fall. Unemployment rates will fall. Remember, inverse relationship between unemployment and GDP. And if you look right here, prices were here and now they're up here. So prices are rising, which is a good thing in this situation because you want to give businesses incentive to produce. Anytime prices are higher, this gives businesses an incentive to produce. So I hope this made sense and maybe answered some of the questions you had with the organizer. If you do have further questions regarding like bond prices or the multiplier or the loanable funds market, jump on the Google Meet and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. Thanks.